Please, let's start the second plenary session of today. We have with us Elisabeth Pacherie. She works at the Institut Jean-Nicot de Paris. She has written a book, Naturaliser l'intentionnalité. Now she's working on another book called Action and Mind. She has written a large number of articles, book chapters, and she has also edited some books. So it's a pleasure for me, and it's a pleasure for all the organizing committee, the Society for Analytic Philosophy, to enjoy her contribution. Thank you.
So thanks to the SEFA for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here among you today. It's an occasion for me to meet colleagues I knew from before, and also to meet new colleagues. And it's been a long day, so thanks to all of you who are still there. So today, the title of my talk is Beyond Automaticity, the Psychological Complexity of Skilled Action. And I first want to... Can I speak like that, or do I need to get closer to the mic? All right. So I first want to make clear what I'm interested in when I talk about skills. There are things like everyday skills. So every child has to learn to tie their shoelaces, or every child, or most children, learn to ride a bike. But these are skills that are typically acquired by everyone. Are considered acquired once they're somehow routinized. This is not the notion of skills that I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is expert skills, the kind of skills epitomized by people like Rafa Nadal in tennis, or Marta Argerich as a concert pianist, or what's her name? Lindsay Vonn as a skier, or Parker as a jazz musician. So the reason I'm interested in expert skill is because I think it offers a fascinating window into the dynamic and flexible interplay of automatic and intentional processes in action. And I want to try and characterize the nature of this interplay. So what I will, and more generally, intentional actions, whether skilled or not, are often contrasted with automatic, habitual, or reflex-like actions. But it's disputed how intentional and automatic processes should be characterized and how strong the contrast is between the two. And it's also highly doubtful that intentional actions are best characterized as involving only intentional processes. Rather, it seems that intentional actions typically involve an interplay of automatic and intentional processes. So there's a question of what forms this interplay takes in general, and the more specific questions of what forms this interplay takes in highly skilled action. So the roadmap for this talk starts by talking about intentionality and automaticity, mentioning the classical dichotomy, and various ways of trying to attenuate this notion that there's a dichotomy by insisting on gradations in automaticity and intentionality, and on the different forms of interplay we can consider to exist between automatic and intentional processes. And then I'll turn to the case of expert skills. I will start by contrasting skills with habits. I will then try to characterize the specific type of flexibility that is a mark of expert skills, and I will try to say something about the type of mental representations that make this flexibility possible. So here's the roadmap. Let's start. intentionality versus automaticity. So classically, automatic processes have been characterized in terms of a list of properties, and if you want to characterize intentional properties, you typically take these properties, put the inverse, and you have your list characterizing intentional properties. Well, the first contrast is between automatic processes as stimulus-driven and intentional processes as goal-directed. Typically, a process or an act is said to be goal-directed if it is driven by representation of a goal. This is quite trivial. And a process or an act is stimulus-driven if it is insensitive to goal representations but triggered by some stimuli that could be external stimuli but also internal stimuli. And in psychology, a standard method for ascertaining whether a certain bit of behavior is goal-directed or stimulus-driven is a procedure called outcome devaluation. So here's a case with a rat, but you can do that with humans as well. Basically, you have a number of instrumental training sessions where you train a rat to press on a pedal to receive pellets of food. Okay? So, and after a while, the rat knows that it has to press on the pedal to get food. Then what you do is that you feed the rat to bursting before putting him back in the experimental situation. And you see what happens. And if the rat doesn't press on the pedal, it means that his behavior is still goal-directed. He will only press on the pedal if his goal is to get food. But if the rat has been overtrained, the rat will press on the pedal even though he doesn't care about the food anymore. And in that case, you have stimulus-driven behavior in the context of the situation, but not goal-directed behavior anymore. So just because this will be a central aspect of the distinction, so that's why I'm insisting on it. Now, other features that have been used to characterize the distinction is between, on the one hand, processes that are, if they're intentional processes, under cognitive control. That is, we're able to start the processes, to inflect their course, to inhibit actions, to actually even prevent ourselves from acting, versus processes that are uncontrollable in one or several of the senses. A second distinction is between processes that are cognitively integrated and flexible, that are sensitive to information from other part of the cognitive systems and will adapt to receiving this new information, and processes that are encapsulated and rigid and are insensitive to external information. A fourth distinction is between processes that involve consciousness and processes that typically take place unconsciously. A fifth distinction is between processes that are efficient in the case of automatic processes, and this means typically that they consume little cognitive resources, whereas if they're non-efficient, they will be cognitively demanding in terms of the resources that will have to be engaged in carrying out this process. A final contrast pair is between processes that are fast and processes that are slower. So now, some of the features associated with automaticity or with intentionality can naturally be considered as gradual, like speed, for instance, or efficiency. Okay, something can be more or less efficient. Others can be considered gradual in a somewhat different sense. For instance, control. Control can take different forms. As I mentioned, you can control whether you start a process. You may be able to control, correct it during its course. You may be able to inhibit the process when started, and so on and so forth. So it may be that some forms of control are maybe present, but others absent. For instance, in ballistic action, you can start the action, but once it's started, there's nothing you can do to alter its course. Same for consciousness. Some aspects of the acting process may be consciously accessible and others not. Same with cognitive integration. A process can be fully or only partially encapsulated, and conversely, cognitive integration may be partial or complete. In addition, it may be questioned whether all the features thought to be characteristic of automatic or vice versa intentional processes are perfectly correlated and strongly interdependent. The all or none conception of automaticity has been challenged by studies showing a lack of co-occurrence among central features of automatic process or central features of intentional processes. For instance, strobe interference, which is thought to be a very automatic process, has been shown and was classically thought to be uncontrollable, is not independent of attention, and you can manipulate your own attention in order to reduce this effect. Similarly, and I don't want to go into this evidence here, but there's been quite a bit of empirical evidence challenging the assumptions that goals are necessary and sufficient for attention, that attention is necessary and sufficient for consciousness, that consciousness is necessary and sufficient for goals. And John Borg, the big specialist of automaticity, even suggested that for any random combinations of these features taken from either list, he could come up with a process that would fit the bill. So you may not want to be as radical as John Borg, but even if you're less radical, many people, both philosophers and psychologists, have proposed that although no single feature may be necessary for automaticity or for intentionality, a subset may be jointly sufficient, and that the more features present, the higher the grade of automaticity or intentionality. For instance, if you consider intentionality, many philosophers acknowledge that intentional acts do not always ensue from deliberations, that agents do not always consider the reasons for their actions, that they do not always need to engage on conscious planning about how to proceed, and they allow for distinctions between full-blooded intentional agency and weaker forms of intentional agency. And you will find the same type of gradualist view in psychology. So, for instance, it's a recent paper on defensive behavior by Ledoux and Doe, and here they distinguish between 6 types of behavior, ranging from the fully automatic to the fully intentional that are responses to danger. So basically, now the dichotomy, the dichotomous picture is waning, more or less, and most people will agree that most actions cannot be identified as involving either only intentional processes or only automatic processes, but rather a mix of intentional and automatic processes. And in particular, it might be argued that intentional actions typically relies, or indeed must rely, at least to some extent, on automatic processes. So the question is, if in most cases we have a complex of automatic and intentional processes, how should we conceive of their interplay? One way to do that is to adopt a hierarchical view. The idea is that the cognitive architecture that underpins intentional action involves a hierarchy of representations and processes that will specify and control the action in a more and more fine-grained way, and that processes at higher levels present most of the mark of intentionality, and that the more we go down this hierarchy of representation and control, the more automatic the processes will become. For instance, although I did not explicitly argue about it in that paper, in this paper where I proposed a hierarchy of intentions and action representation, I was implicitly assuming that this was the case. So I will offer here a little mea culpa about that. Some researchers have argued recently in favor of a more dynamic interplay between automatic and intentional processes, and they've pointed out that the intentionality automaticity gradient need not always be aligned with the action representation hierarchy. And so here's in a recent paper by Ferry Cushman, and I don't remember, I don't remember her first name, Morris. Here's an example they give. Consider, for instance, a seasoned journalist who reports on new events each day. At a high level of abstraction, her reporting is structured around a repetitive series of goal-directed actions. Follow leads, interview sources, evade mailing editors, etc. Because its actions are reliably valuable for any news event, their selection is an excellent candidate for what they call habitual control. The concrete steps necessary to carry out any individual actions will be highly variable, however. Optimal behavior when interviewing a pop star may be suboptimal when interviewing the Pope. Thus, the implementation of the abstract actions is an excellent candidate for planning, and these examples, I say, illustrate the utility of nesting elements of both habits and plans in a hierarchy of behavioral control. What it suggests more specifically is that the more variability there is at one level, the more you will have goal-directed processes. The more invariant the relations at a given level, the more you can go by with habitual control. So, this was a general presentation of this debate about automaticity versus intentionality, and now let us return to expert skills. And as I said at the outset, I'm interested in expert skills because of the perspectives they offer into this dynamic and flexible interplay of automatic and intentional processes in action. So, one way to try and say more about that is to start by asking the question, what does it take to become an expert tennis player or an expert pianist? And what does exactly expertise in these domains involve? And sorry, I should have pointed out, here I will concentrate on an example of expertise that have a physical component, okay? I'm not talking about expertise in mathematics or chess or whatever, although I think most of what I say could be transferred to this domain, but here I'm concentrating on physical skills, or skills with a physical dimension. So, most obviously, acquiring a skill requires lots of practice. Practice leads to an improvement in the ability to select appropriate actions, to select them rapidly, and to execute the selected actions accurately, while at the same time leading to a reduction of the cognitive load required to perform the task. That's from a recent paper by Hess and Krakauer. The problem, though, is that these properties are not unique to skill learning. You could say that they're also a characteristic of the formation of good habits. So what is it then that distinguishes skills from habits? It is common in psychology to draw the contrast between skills and habits in terms of, as I mentioned in the first part, intentional, goal-directed actions versus automatic stimulus-driven actions. Philosophers are sometimes more blunt, and they will say that skilled actions are intelligent, whereas habitual actions are dumb or merely mechanical. But then, what does the intelligence of skill consist in? So, let us turn to two classical papers on the contrast between skills and rigidity. First, Gilbert Wright in the nature of mind, right? And Julia Hannas in a more recent paper. The first distinguishing characteristic the first distinction they draw is between the flexibility of skill and the rigidity of habits. It is of the essence of merely habitual practices that one one performance is a replica of its predecessors. It is of the essence of intelligent practices that one performance is modified by its predecessors. Exercises of habitual practices are uniform. Exercises of intelligent practices are indefinitely heterogeneous. And Julia Hanna's, going in the same direction, it is central to routine that the reaction to the relevant situation is always the same. This is why routine is predictable and dependable, which is often useful. Expertise, however, results in reactions that differentiate among and are appropriate to different situations. So these are philosophical views, and here the view from an actual expert. So here's Nadal in an interview book telling us this. You might think that after millions and millions of balls have hit and have the basic shots of tennis show up, that reliably hitting a true, smooth, clean shot every time would be a piece of cake. But it isn't. Not just because every day you wake up feeling differently, but because every shot is different. Every single one. From the moment the ball is in motion, it comes at you at I think there was a mistake, like infinitesimal, I don't think that's the right word, number of angles and speeds, with more topspin, backspin, flatter or higher. The differences might be minute, microscopic, but so are the variations your body makes: shoulders, elbow, wrists, hips, ankles, knees, in every shot. And there are so many other factors: the weather, the surface, the rival. So, flexibility versus rigidity. Second distinction to draw is between skill as cognitively controlled or integrated, and habit as lacking control or cognitive control or integration. So, right again, when we describe someone as doing something by pure or blind habit, we mean that he does it automatically and without having to mind what he's doing. He does not exercise care, vigilance, or criticism. In contrast, the expert thinks what he is doing. Julia Annas, echoing that, the expertise is not detached from the person's ability to think and decide consciously. The playing is continually responsive to my thought about the piece. I mean, she's taking the example of playing the piano, my decisions to speed up or slow down, and the like. Third distinction is in terms of the mode of acquisition of skills versus habits. So right again, we build up habits by drill, but we build up intelligent capacities by training. Drill or conditioning consists in the imposition of repetitions. Training, on the other hand, though it embodies plenty of sheer drill, does not consist of drill. It involves a stimulation by criticism and example of the pupil's own judgment. He learns how to do things, thinking what he's doing, so that every operation performed is itself a new lesson to him how to perform better. And same with Julia Hannas. The successful learners strive to improve. So basically, they're all on the same line here. So let me try and say a little bit more about flexibility and control. Flexibility comes in degrees, and it is a matter of sensitivity to different aspects of action control. There are at least three dimensions of flexibility that must be accounted for if we want to give an account of skill. One is strategic sensitivity. Flexibility requires that action control be sensitive to the agent's personal level goals and changes thereof. Second is situational sensitivity. Flexibility requires sensitivity to the situation of action, and this involves attending to properties of the current context that are relevant to an agent's goal. And third, you have what you may call implementation or sensory motor sensitivity. Flexibility requires sensitivity to immediate sensory changes in the environment. The skilled performers adaptively responds to sensory perturbations to ensure optimal performance as an action unfolds. So this is quite dry and abstract. So Rafael Nadal again So at a strategic level, he may form the intention to play largely from the back of the court, based on his assessment of the strengths and the weaknesses of both players. At a situational level, he may form, at a particular point in the game, an intention to play a deep, down-the-line backhand shot, given respective current positions of players, length of the exchanges, and so on and so forth. And at the implementation sensory model level, he might need to adjust his posture, the force, and the direction of shot in response to visual information about the incoming ball. Okay? So these are different forms of flexibility. A number of people have recently tried to offer hybrid theories of skill, trying to account for these different forms of flexibility. So here I will mention two such attempts. One is by Wayne Christensen, John Sutton, and Doris McIlwain, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, who propose what they call a mesh theory. So the mesh theory of control in skilled action proposes that controlled and automatic processes are closely integrated in skilled action, and that cognitive control directly influences motor execution in many cases. The theory also insists that cognitive control involves a broader range of processes than just conscious thought and deliberation. In particular, they argue that one of the functions of cognitive control is the flexible integration of information concerning the situation that will contribute to situation awareness and to the definition of what they call an action gist, where an action gist specifies not just an action type, but also a particular way of performing the action that is appropriate to the circumstances and that thus directly shapes execution and can contribute to the regulation of execution. Conversely, the theory allows for a graded notion of automaticity, with weaker forms of automaticity possessing only some of the classical properties associated with automaticity. And they propose that automation tends to be strongest, though not complete, for motor control because it tends to involve relatively stable relations in contrast to higher order features of actions that tend to show more substantial variability. Okay. A second view, which presents a number of similarities, is the hybrid theory recently defended by Ellen Friedland. And according to her, skilled action is characterized by three types of control processes that are working together. Strategic control, which is a function of the agent's goals, plans, and strategies guiding her skilled performance. And strategic control is concerned with the integration of domain general information that tends to be quite variable, and this tends to prevent at least automatization from occurring at this level of strategic control. Second thing she introduced is this idea of selective top-down automatic attentional processes, which are the processes by which an agent selects appropriate features of the environment for implementing her action goals, provided at the level of strategic control. And what she argues is that this attention is not deployed by way of explicit intentions to attend to this or that, but still is guided by your intention to perform this or that action. Okay? And finally, motor control, which is responsible for the exact nuanced ways in which a skilled performer modifies, adjusts, and guides her still instantiations. And this she takes to be typically heavily automatized by way of practice and training. But she also insists that while an agent's strategic decisions do not guide motor control processes each step of the way, they can intervene at various junctions if necessary. So automatic processes are not impenetrable by cognitive control processes. So if we try and summarize these two views, okay, the three admits of three levels of flexibility, though with strategic control at the highest level, some form of situational control at the intermediate level, and form of flexibility that has to do with the implementation of the action and is sensory, motor, in kind. And they tend to agree that the lower you are, the more automaticity you will find, and the higher you are, the more intentional cognitive control you will find. But they think that cognitive control can actually act all the way down on the hierarchy. Okay. So both accounts posit the need for this intermediate form of control between high-level cognitive control by intentions and largely, but not fully, automatic motor control. Both accounts also offer suggestions regarding the processes at work at this intermediate level. So Friedland insists on selective attention. Christensen and colleagues insist on information integration processes yielding action gists. Both accounts suggest that these processes yield a more fine-grained representation of the action than the representation encoded at the level of strategic intentions. Yet neither tells us much about how these information integration processes or these attentional processes are themselves guided, except to say that guidance by intentions or by strategic intentions is somehow indirect. So what I want to do in the time that remains is try to say a little more about the kind of representational structures that have to be in place in order to guide these processes. How long have I been speaking? Okay, I still have 15 minutes?
35 minutes.
Okay. No, we started late.
Yeah.
Trying to buy time. Okay, so the mental representations of experts. So the classical literature on skills in psychology insisted on skill as automatizations. And an opponent of this view, Erickson, argued quite forcefully that rather than being the mark of expert performance, full automatization corresponds to what he called arrested development. In his view, expert performers counteract automaticity by developing increasingly complex mental representations to attain higher levels of control over their performance. Thus, what distinguishes expert performers from novices or from merely competent performers, like the professional tennis player from the amateur or the beginner, is the complexity and accuracy of their mental representations of their domain of expertise and of their repertoire of actions, and the way these representations guide action selection and control action implementation. So here I want to insist on perhaps two types of complex mental representations that are present in experts. The first I call structured action representations, or SARs for short, and the seconds are internal model of the domain. So structured action representations, here I'm using empirical evidence from a German sports psychologist, Thomas Schack, who studied the structure of action representation in experts in contrast to less proficient players or novices. And what he found was that the structure of action representations in experts has a distinctive hierarchical organization that is well matched with the functional and temporal organization of the action and exhibits very little variance from player to player. In contrast, in amateurs, action representations show less hierarchical organizations, are less well matched with the functional phases of the action, and inter-individual variability is much higher. In novices, there's almost no hierarchical structure. Thus, the main difference between experts and non-experts is not necessarily a difference in what motor schemas are used, but in how they are functionally integrated and how fine-tuned they are. And here I have to start a short movie, but I don't know how to do it with this. So I would like you to pay special attention. So one team is in yellow, the other is in black. so to the black team, and the player will appear on the left-hand side of the screen. I think her number is 8, I'm not sure. Sorry for the music. All right. And from another angle. Okay, so I learned that this is called an attack hit. In
Brazil against?
Sorry?
Brazil versus?
It was Brazil versus don't remember. Germany, I think. Germany. So here's a still picture of an attack hit. So Thomas Schack used some complex experimental method, which I could describe if you want to, but I don't think this is your main interest here, to extract the internal representations of this specific move in volleyball from players without explicitly asking about them. So he was implicitly trying to figure out what kind of representation they had in long-term memory of this particular move. And what he found through this method is actually that on the left-hand side you have the experts, and you see that there's a proper hierarchy with the depths indicating more hierarchical structure, and that actually the hierarchy matches fairly well the temporal organization of the sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 correspond to the temporal organization of the sequence. If you look at non-experts, you see that the hierarchy is less marked, and that functionally is less well organized and doesn't correspond to the functional and temporal organization of the sequence in as good a way. So, what does it? So, what the way to understand structured action representations is as both representational and control structures. So, a well-formed structured action representation is a hierarchically structured assemblage of more basic motor schemas that cuts actions at its functional and temporal joints, with nodes at high levels clustering basic actions units with respect to the distinct phases and functional demands or sub-goals of the task. Non-terminal nodes terminal nodes correspond to basic motor schema. What is a motor schema in this literature? A motor schema is a model program that has both invariant features. Think, for instance, of grasping for an object. In an act of grasping, there's always an opening and a closing of the effector, and some variable surface parameters. How I will grasp will depend on the size and position of the object, its structure. I won't hold a crystal glass in the same way that I hold a less fragile object, and so on and so forth. So you have a representation, a schema with both fixed elements and parameters that need to be specified according to context. And so you also need mappings from context to the schema in order to set these parameters. And you can also use a schema to predict what the sensory consequences of this parameterization should be, so that you can use that to control the action. And the thought about structured action representation is that they're actually a hierarchical arrangement of schemas where you have a number of non-terminal nodes that you can use as intermediate control units. And these intermediate control units can be used both for controlling attentional deployment to the relevant environmental properties and for controlling action execution, making it possible to exert some form of cognitive control over action implementation. So to make this a little bit more concrete, so let's go back to our attack hit in tennis. If you're a novice, you have a series of motor schemas. You're told that you should do this, that, and that, and that, and that, and that, and basically you do each step of the recipe one at a time. Okay. The classical view of expertise is that this becomes fully automatized, so that all these elements are chunked together and that you trigger the whole sequence. The SOAR view is that actually you have some hierarchical structure in that. So you can actually either trigger the whole sequence and then it goes on automatically, but also you may want to specify more precisely one or another parameter of the action. So if instead of a normal attack hit, you want to do a feint attack hit, you can intervene on the control node that controls the last bit of the sequence, the way you slap on the ball. So this is for action implementation, but expertise is not just a matter of how accurately one executes selected action, it is also a matter of selecting appropriate actions in the first place. So let me start with an everyday example, and my friend Pierre's decision. So Pierre is a born and bred Parisian. He's lived in various neighborhoods in Paris. He doesn't own a car, and he takes public transportation to go from one place to another. He prides himself on knowing the public transportation network inside out. He doesn't need a map. It's all in there. How does he decide which means of transportation to use to get from point A to point B? Well, it depends. If Pierre wants to get from home to work, he can certainly rely on habit, knowing from experience that taking bus 27 is the fastest way to get there. If in contrast the route is unfamiliar, say he needs to go from his dentist appointment to the opera ticket office, he will use his internal model of the transportation network, try to figure out what the options are and compute the best route. So I won't go into that, but okay, I could go this way or that way, but that will take longer, that will be nicer, blah, blah, blah. So an internal model here represents the structure of the environment, so in Pierre's case, the Parisian public transportation network, as well as various bits of ancillary information, for instance, setting views, depending on which means of transportation you take, slow buses, and so on. Internal models can be used to compute on the fly the optimal action given the structure of the environment and the agent's goal. They can be more or less detailed. Someone who has lived in Paris for only a couple of years won't have as complete and detailed an internal model of public transportation as an old-timer like Pierre. And Pierre can thus either rely on habit or he can consult his internal model of the transportation network to decide which route to take. And this echoes a distinction that is drawn in modern decision research between two main strategies for solving an action selection problem. What is called in this literature the habitual or model-free strategy versus the planning or model-based strategy. So the habitual or model-free strategy is a form of Thorndike's law of effects. So a value is associated to an action based on how it's been rewarded in the past, and this value is incrementally updated. So if I start taking bus 27 to go to work and it takes me there, the value of taking bus 27 is incrementally augmented and so on and so forth, so that after a while this will be the option. This strategy is computationally efficient, but it's inflexible in the face of change. For instance, in the spring, for the first time in over 40 years, they decided to update the bus routes in Paris. So they have new buses, new stops, and so on and so forth. So everybody who was relying on pure habit got lost for a while, myself included, because there used to be only one bus stopping at my bus stop. Now there are two, and a couple times I found myself taking the wrong bus, okay, because I was just acting on habit. The other strategy, the model-based strategy, involves learning a causal model of the environment, where this model will be used to compute the optimal action given the agent's goal. And these strategies allows for greater flexibility, more accurate action selection, but it's more costly computationally. And what I want to propose is that an important thing that distinguishes experts from ordinary mortals is that they have acquired a very detailed and accurate model of their domain that allows them, when planning, to make optimal decisions. But there's a problem here. To say that structured action representations provide the expert with a range of intermediate control nodes over action when implementing them isn't to say that the expert should, in each of her actions, exert intentional control on each and every possible node of control. Similarly, to say that having a detailed internal model of the domain allows an expert to make optimal choices of action isn't to say that they should always rely on model-based strategy. If it were so, the price to pay for flexibility would be loss of efficiency and speed, and in expertise you need both flexibility and speed and efficiency. So rather, an expert is one who knows when to let things happen, that is, release control to automatic processes, and when to make things happen, that is, exercise cognitive control over action selection and execution. And we may call this meta-flexibility, so a fourth form of flexibility. But how do we arbitrate between letting things happen and making things happen? And the major goal of current decision research is to try and understand how people decide from moment to moment which strategy to use, whether to let things run automatically or whether to exert cognitive control. And recent meta-control models have proposed that arbitration can best be understood as a form of cost-benefit decision-making, where choice between strategies is determined by the expected reward for a given strategy, subtracted by the cost of computation and time. However, as some of these people have pointed out, if the purpose of meta-control is to avoid unnecessary deployment of cognitive control, then this purpose is undermined by engaging in an explicit and demanding computation to determine whether to exercise cognitive control, okay? Because you're paying the cost of the decision. So to avoid this regress, they suggest that actually meta-control may itself be a form of habitual model-based control, that is a function of the past history and cost and rewards associated with using one strategy rather than the other. So in the context of skill, this proposal is especially attractive. A skilled agent is one who engages in continuous learning. Experts are committed to mastering their craft and developing it over time through hours and hours of practice and training. And through this process, they build up an extensive history of costs and rewards associated with the use of different control strategies in distinct types of circumstances within their domain. Though we should predict that in light of their dedicated training, experts are able to fine-tune the kind of cost-benefit analysis that is thought to drive the meta-control of action selection strategies. So, to recap and to go back a little bit to Gilbert Wright and Julia Annas, they insist that expert skill acquisition presents unique features. The first is that it requires variation rather than mere repetition. And you can make sense of that if you understand that this is crucial to the acquisition of accurate structured action representations and of precise mappings between relevant environmental properties, action parameters, and expected consequences. They also insist on the importance of critical attitude and understanding. The intelligent performers monitor their progress, identify their mistake, and try to figure out why they failed or succeeded and how they can improve their performance. And together with variation, a critical attitude is crucial to the acquisition of accurate internal models of the domain. And finally, Wright and Annas insist on continuous learning. Experts are committed to mastering their craft and never stop practicing. And the extraordinary wealth of experience that thus amass is key to reliable meta-control. They know when to let things happen, want to make things happen.
Many thanks. So we have 40 minutes for questions and debate.
Not 40, 40.
40, yes, not 14. 40. Yeah. All right, thank you. Jesus? Well.
Thank you. Two short questions. First one will be between the automatic processes and the ones that are conscious. The description that you have given seems to match perfectly into the dual process theory, System 1 and System 2. And I was wondering what would be your stance about that, if you think that that there are two different systems implementing each one of those two ways of performing. That's the first one. And the second one will be if you have been consciously avoiding the use of the expression knowledge how, because even when you have been talking about Ryle or Juliana, you have been trying to talk only in terms of skill. And I was wondering if that is intentional and there will be a reason for that. Thank you.
Okay. The first, either you talk in terms of System 1 versus System 2, or either, there's a distinction between talking about System 1 versus System 2, where you actually have systems, and talking about Type 1 processes and Type 2 processes. Because with Type 1 and Type 2 processes, you can actually allow for the possibility that these two types of processes might sometimes work together and cooperate, rather than the classical view of System 1 and System 2 being in competition. So that's why I don't think I was avoiding. I was avoiding many things, but I was avoiding that among other things. The second thing about knowledge how and knowledge that is I wanted, this was a cowardly move on my part. I wanted to avoid entering in this debate about whether knowledge how is some form of knowledge that or not. I think not, but I didn't want to go into my reasons for that here. But I think probably part of what I say on structured action representation and how they might be acquired suggests that these may precede actual propositional knowledge. So that propositional knowledge, I don't understand the moves of the people who defend the knowledge. Jason Stanley's move. I don't buy it, and I actually don't even get it. So it's probably why I was trying to avoid this.
I think this is a very quick question. So you said that there are three kinds of flexibility: strategic sensitivity, situational sensitivity, and implementation sensory model sensitivity. And then you said the situational sensitivity is like an intermediate level of control, and you said there were two ways of understanding. Well, you presented two examples of people who said, maybe it's the capturing the action gist or selective attention, what you do in this intermediate level, and then you move to talking about structured action representation. Okay. So I was wondering whether structured action representations only appear in in that intermediate level, or they are in all the three different levels of control?
Sorry, I had a longer version of the talk. Actually, I could have said more about that, but I skipped it because I thought it would be too long. But one of the reasons I wanted to introduce this notion of structured action representations is to try and make sense of Ellen Friedman's claim that selective attentions play a role at this intermediate level, because she insists that when you form an intention to let's say, play a certain type of shot in tennis, you do not form subsidiary intentions to tend to this or that, but that nevertheless your intention somehow guides the deployment of attention. Okay? So I was trying to say, okay, but then how does it work exactly? And the idea is that actually, and the proposal would be that when you form an intention and you're skilled, you also activate these structured action representations. And these structured action representations, because they're not just representations but also control structure, they will control the deployment of attention to relevant elements of the situation. Now, you can say also that structured action representations are not necessarily explicitly present at the level of intentions. At the level of intentions, strategic intentions, you might only have some general notion of this kind of hit or that kind of hit. But then, because they're hierarchical structures, typically the bottom level is that of model schemas, and this is typically the levels at which fine-grained model controls takes place. So I would think that they span between the intermediate and the bottom level, and they're triggered by the content of intentions if you have acquired the relevant representations. In other places I talk about executive concepts of actions, and what I meant by executive concepts of actions are concepts of actions to which such structured action representations are attached.
I had also a very brief question. So you said that experts know when to let things go and then turn automatic. But according to what the slide that you had about Nadal commenting on his playing, that can never happen. I mean, it's every single ball is going to be different, so it's I don't know where you can find space to let things go.
But this need not be at the level of motor execution. Okay, it may be that although there are very many different ways to adjust in order to hit a ball, it is automatic for you that when the ball is arriving and you're in this position, the shots you should play is that shot. So you might still have to consider quite a bit of sensory information in order to make the motor adjustments. And here, this can't be fully automatic, but it may be that, and that's why I insisted that automaticity is not necessarily restricted to the button, just like the journalist example that I used from Cushman and Morris, that sometimes automaticity can take place at higher levels. So a certain shot, given a certain position, might be the thing to do. And being very creative may be that on some occasions you decide not to do the thing to do, to surprise your opponent.
Thank you, that was lovely. I want to say something nice about habits. Okay, so you said that, well, skills are built by training and habits are built by drill. So the first are intelligent and habits are dumb. So I feel we should
apply certain habits.
Yes, in the following sense, I wonder whether a way, because also you said in talking about the dynamic system, so the non-hierarchical view of to play this, how to understand this interplay between intentionality and automaticity. You seem to opt for the more dynamic approach, and according to this dynamic approach, which I think, I kind of like it, I agree, that any level, it's not like there is a higher level where things are more intentional and as we go lower things get more automatic, but every level will have that mixture of those two. But then if we stick to the dynamic model, it seems to me that one way of understanding the sort of the automaticity that is involved at each level of the processing of information is to talk about habits. I mean, dumb in a sense that is not that dumb. So there is a sense in which the habituation, also at the personal level, but also at the subpersonal level, is crucial and is not really that dumb. So,
No. I want to agree with you. I think what Ryle and Anna said in mind was something that was fully habitual from step one to final step. Whereas, of course, the flexibility, I mean, if you want flexibility and efficiency at the same time, you have to be able to combine more habitual processes with more intentional processes. So to be skilled is to be able to do this combination in an intelligent way. And I insisted from the beginning, intentional processes, or what we call intentional actions, are never intentional all the way down or all the way up, actually.
Hi, thank you so much. It was so interesting. So I'm interested in joint activities where you have like two pair skaters or dancers, and when it seems you might want to say that the pair is skilled, not just that the individuals are skilled, and so that you might want to talk about meshing not only within the individual but across the individual, and I'm just interested if you have any thoughts about that.
No, first I think this is actually very interesting. I've been working on joint action, but actually not on skilled joint action. But I would say that indeed, what immediately comes to mind is that when you're acting in a skillful way together with someone else, one thing that is important is that you attend to the other, and what the other is doing is that you be responsive to that. So the flexibility, I mean, the other is also not just an element of your strategic plan, but it's also an element of the situation, and it's also an element of sensory motor adjustments. So if for instance, two people are dancing the tango together, the mesh is not just at the strategic level, it's not just at the intermediate level, it has to go all the way down to the motor level. And there's actually quite a bit of empirical work on the kind of processes of synchronizations and so on, and joint attention that are involved in that. So
I was thinking too that the action representations have to mesh in some way. And so it's not just that it's my idiosyncratic action representations, but we have to have them, in a handshake model or a pairing model or something like that. Because if we don't, and the information about, the shared signals, we have to be able to signal each other about what's happening. And those signals are going to have to be communicative in some way. So there's going to have to be so sometimes it's not just responsiveness to the body, but a kind of semantic
Oh yeah, sure.
No.
But for instance, I mean, there's interesting work showing that chamber music musicians, they actually exaggerate instrumental actions in order to coordinate with others. So, for instance, the first violin will reach their bow higher, exaggerate their movement to signal the temp. I mean, to make sure that they're synchronized. To take just one example. So there's plenty of things like that, and there's quite a bit of discussion as to. Okay, some people have proposed that actually when you're in a joint action, or this type of joint action, where I mean small scale typically, people have not just a representation of their action, but a generalized representation of the action. And in some cases, roles can be distributed in advance, but in some cases, roles will be assigned on the fly, so to speak.
That's really wonderful, thank you.
Or someone else.
Hi, thank you. So you said that you were going to focus on expert-skilled action with a physical component, but I was wondering whether there would be maybe a substantial difference between cases that had quite a strong strategic element to them, as the ones that you discussed, that involve sport, and cases instead of perhaps playing music, playing an instrument, or whether, particularly because you were saying that the flexibility element is what is really important, and I was wondering whether we can treat these skilled actions alike, or whether there might be a substantial difference there.
So let's take chess as an example. It's obvious that, okay, in traditional chess at least, it's obvious that there's still some, minor physical components. You have to take pieces and push them on the board. But of course, how you move your pieces is really not crucial to success. So in this case, you would say that motor flexibility isn't really very important. But there's something more than just strategic intentions that are important. There's also, it's very important to be able to see what's going on, literally see what's going on, attend to what's going on. And there's some interesting empirical evidence that if you ask a chess experts to memorize the position of pieces on the chessboard, they will do much better than me, for instance. I don't play chess, or people who don't play chess more generally, but only if the way the pieces are placed on the board makes sense from a chess point of view. If you just put pieces at random on the board, their performance won't be any better than everyone else, which means that they've learned to see the pieces on the board in a way that is specific to chess, and they code it in terms of positions, possible moves, and so on and so forth. So this means that it's not just strategic, there's also this understanding the gist of the situation is also crucial there. And if you play chess, I don't know, I don't play chess, so I really, talking from the top of my head here, but I guess when people play chess without even using a board, there's some kind of imagination also going on. So it's not just strategic reflection and things like that.
Let me tell you something. I think there's some authors like Daniel Wegner, for instance, insist that almost all of our behavior is automatic, and so this view undermines voluntary, intentional, free action. So I'm really very much in agreement with your view, because I tend to think that, in some sense, it is true that much of our behavior is automatic, but unless it were so, our intentional behavior would be much less, with more.
We would achieve
done.
very little.
Very little, exactly. For instance, if I set myself a purpose or an end, say to go out for a coffee, that's what I intentionally do for a coffee. But there are thousands and thousands of bodily movements, which really don't are controlled by our conscious will. Otherwise, we probably would never get to the coffee if we had to control, the conscious way in every step or every part of a step. So I think it's contrary to view automaticity as something that goes against intelligent, intentional behavior. I think it's just a possibility condition of that.
Sorry, I didn't want to say that each and every time some automatic process is involved, it makes everything dumb. I just wanted to say that only automatic processes won't give rise to very intelligent situation. Intelligent action. Actually, intelligent action relied on this right mix of intentional and automatic processes as my slogan, knowing when to let things happen, automaticity, and knowing when to make things happen. And so I would say that intelligent behavior is not just intentional control. It's actually being able to know when to engage in intentional control and when not. If you really were to decide to do everything intentionally in going to go for a cup of coffee, this would be pretty dumb behavior. I'm sorry, I don't want to say that. But
right.
So not only is it dumb to go only automatic, but it's also dumb to go intentional, when actually it would be more efficient and as reliable to engage in automatic processes. So the intelligent thing is finding the right balance between the two.
I wouldn't say that going out for a coffee is a great achievement. Anyway, it's an intentional action. So, just a second question. Somehow, what do you think are habitual actions intentional, or what do you say about this? That sort of.
Okay, so Carlos is asking me whether I think habitual actions are intentional in some way. So my answer would be in some way. And again, because I try to deconstruct this dichotomous understanding of automaticity versus goal-directedness, I think habitual actions are not reflexes. Okay, there's habitual actions, there's some form of control we can exert, cognitive control we can exert about habitual actions. For one thing, if we become aware, I used to be a smoker, so when I saw myself going for my nth cigarette, I was able, sometimes, to refrain myself and stop my action. Another way in which, this notion of goal-directedness, I'm supposed to be preparing a paper on that, but I haven't started, but this notion of goal-directedness is actually a very ambiguous notion, because you could say that all actions, apart from perhaps mere reflexes, have an element of goal-directedness, because there's some internal goal to the action, even if, let's say, this rat we were talking about that is pressing on this lever, is satiated, it doesn't want any food, still pressing on the lever, that's the goal, which is to depress the lever, which is internal to the act itself. So in this sense, if the rat misses the lever, it will correct his action. So there's this very minimal notion of goal-directedness, which is not the notion of goal-directedness that people are interested in when they're contrasted habitual and goal-directed actions. They want a notion of a goal that is extrinsic to the motor act itself. So I would say habitual actions are minimally intentional in the sense that they're teleological, and in the sense that there some forms of cognitive control over habitual actions are possible. Okay.
Minimally intentional, you think?
Yeah, well, I would.
Right. So you think that there are levels of intentionality?
I think that there are levels. That's
right.
in between the fully intentional and the fully reflexive.
So for instance, brushing your teeth every morning, that will be habitual. I think it's fully intentional. Anyway, I mean, it has a you would explain that perfectly in terms of
but
desires, beliefs, and so on. Even if you're not fully conscious of those desires, those beliefs, but it's really true that you are doing that because you
But
want
lots
to.
of action slips stem from habits. Like if instead of the toothpaste, which is normally, let's say, on the left side of the sink, someone puts some kind of hand cream, and you find yourself putting some of that cream on your toothbrush, this is not intentional, and this is the habit that made you act in this way.
Well, So I think
so the type of action, maybe we can distinguish. I don't know. I mean, I'm just improvising here. Maybe we can distinguish between the intentionality of the type of action. So, an element, I mean, on a particular instance of that type of habit, it has it inherits the intentionality that was linked to the acquisition of the habit, but it may also have, depending on the context, elements that actually counteract the reasons why we try to acquire the habit in the first hand. So I want to acquire the habit of, let's say, brushing my teeth because I want not to forget, and so on and so forth. So the action is intentional because of the way I try to acquire the habit. But if instead of using toothpaste, I use something else because it happened to be a place where the toothpaste is, this element of my action is not intentional, and the habit is also responsible for that.
Right. It's just that I would tend to draw a distinction between habitual and expert. I don't think that brushing your teeth reveals a lot of expertise, but anyway, I would think that both are intentional. Anyway, so I think that there was someone there. Okay.
Thank you very much. I really liked it. It's a short question, and I don't know if there's time for it, but I wanted to know if you could say a bit more about this meta-control layer that in itself is habitual, because I think that beautifully vindicates habits at the most higher order, and it was regarding this discussion. So I think that's.
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's really a very hot topic in computational approaches to decision theory at the moment. So it's one proposal among several, and I don't think the evidence is in right now to say, okay, this is the right model. I mean, there are other ways to try and solve this problem and avoid some kind of regress. But actually, I really like it. I want it to be true because I think it nicely closes the loop. So this is, okay, I shouldn't do that as a philosopher, but it is a bit of wishful thinking on my part because it makes the picture beautiful if indeed this meta-control is a form of habitual control. So okay, you forced me to acknowledge that.
Anyone else? No, I think it's, if nobody else is the one? No. Okay. Victor.
Yeah, so I just can't help to ask this question. So yeah, well, of course your focus on is intentional action. But then some of the things you said about different degrees of flexibility and habitualness. I was thinking, well, maybe you could also make sense of a notion of skillful, surely not intentional, action for animals. And so the thing you said about the rat, I don't see there is any extension of your account to animal, doings or action, non-intentional actions. So I think there is a sense in which you could say that a dog can learn to perform, I don't know how to call it, an action in a skillful way, or other animals could learn certain behaviors, right? I think that would be the so skillful behaviors that are not intentional. So would your model extend to something like that?
But here you seem to be assuming that animals cannot act intentionally, and I would not accept this premise.
All right. Okay. Good. So you think there is animal intentional action?
Yeah, sure.
Generally.
I mean, not in the sense probably of not in the a very strong sense of deliberation, previous deliberations, being able to actually provide reasons for why you do that, but intentional in a more modest way of being goal-directed, involving planning and so on and so forth. Certainly, I would say that many animal species are capable of intentional action in that sense. And actually, some animal species seems to be able to think ahead, like corvids, for instance, are very good at planning, not just great herps, but also in other genera. So so probably, I'm not sure animals could become experts in the sense I was talking about, but they can certainly become skilled in a less demanding sense. So, animals don't wear shoes, but something analogous to tying your shoes is something that animals could become very adept at doing fairly well. So they would be skilled in that less demanding sense, not perhaps.
So the center would be more or less step forward.
No, it's just, if I can, I think it's all too natural when you say a dog going for water, that he wants water and that he believes that there's water there. So even obviously not in the propositional or linguistic form, but I think they have actually, superior animals have actually desired beliefs, which I don't know whether you
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's discussion as to whether they could have something like future-directed intentions in Bradman's sense, but even for that, there's some evidence that at least some of the great apes have behavior that seems to indicate that they're able to plan their action in advance and have intentions for the future. So, there's quite a bit of debate right now on that.
Augustine.
So I was thinking about the case at the higher level or the strategic level. You let things go, so it's there is some automaticity there. Would you say, what would you say in this case, that it's goal-directed, the action is goal-directed, or, I mean, because you're not controlling the goals?
You're talking about this example of the journalist that I mentioned? Yeah. I mean, there's this interesting question of, okay, so you have a goal in general. I mean, of whole sub-goals are related to goals. So you might assume that she has some intentional goal to pursue her calling as a journalist, and that part of that is to interview people and get news and so on and so forth. Now, how you do that, I mean, okay. So I mean, there's this question of the transitivity of goal directedness, so to speak. So if I have a goal and a relevant sense, and from these goals, I mean, and in order to achieve these goals, I have to achieve a number of sub-goals. So it's a question of how you move from the goals to the sub-goals. Either you plan, and then your sub-goals are also intentional sub-goals, or it's part of the routine. And as long as the routine is not triggered just of itself, but is under the control of this superordinate goal, I would still say that this is goal-directed behavior. But the goal-directedness is inherited from the level above.
According to the schedule, we should have already finished.
Okay, we are done.
I don't know whether someone else, but it should be something very brief question because we have run out of time. So, yeah, okay, very brief, please.
Perhaps the response would be very brief because maybe I'm afraid it's a bit far from the center of your topic. But you were saying that your notion of expertise could be extended not only to physical skills but also to intellectual skills. I wonder if it could be extended as well to another domain, which would be moral skills. And because if you take the Aristotelian notion of virtue, this supposes a certain kind of habituation. And I wondered if among moral virtues there could be a difference between the moral skills and the moral habits, and even perhaps a notion of moral expertise in the sense of moral expert skills. But I don't know if this is something you have given a thought about.
So I'm really not an expert on this topic, but I guess, for instance, Julia Hannas, who normally writes on the virtues rather than on skills versus habit, would be perfectly happy with maintaining a distinction between moral habits and moral skills. And probably also, I was talking earlier about even in skills like chess, the ability to attend to elements of the situations that are relevant to making the right decisions. Okay, something you learn in chess, it's something you learn in tennis, and it's probably also something that you may learn when becoming more skilled at moral evaluation. But I'm really out of my ground here, so.
Now I think we should finish now. Thank you very much to our invited